Chapter 4, An Eternity with Friends. An Eternity with Friends. Nalya paused, a hand resting on the handle of yet another tavern door. That was the third she had visited since entering the slums that afternoon, and the only thing to differentiate each had been the name. She glanced about her, the rank smell mingling with the general squalor of her surroundings and depressing her further, that people were forced to live in such conditions. She shook herself. She hadn't time for that now. The attack on her keep had turned the tables on her, and for once it was she who needed help. She had covered the all taverns in Joaquin's Promenade and Bridge district that morning to no avail. If she didn't find someone soon. Nalya drew a breath, trying to ignore the smell as she quelled the sudden panic that had risen within her. Father was relying on her, as was the rest of the keep, and she would not let them down. She stepped over the threshold, her eyes scanning the bar in an instant. She had visited enough of those places, both that morning and before, to know a likely group when she saw one, and the pair in the corner looked the part, a huge bald man with a tall female companion, both armed, and paying little attention to the drunken commotion of their surroundings. She crossed purposefully to their table, swallowed and began.
"Excuse me? You are for hire? As mercenaries, I mean," she added as the woman glanced up sternly. "My keep is under siege and I come to hire men to help rout the enemy."
The woman stared at her a moment, finally kicking out a chair, and Nalya took it as an invitation to sit down.
"I am Jahara, this is Minsk,"
the woman explained briskly with a nod to the man,
"and we have another 3 in our company."
4, interrupted the man at her side with a smile, and Nalya glanced over to him, alarmed to notice a small brown rodent sat eating the crumbs from his plate. Jahara's nostrils dilated slightly, but she said nothing, eyes boring into hers as though daring Nalya to comment as well, and the girl merely nodded once.
"I can guarantee 500 gold for the task, as well as whatever honors my father can bestow once our home is again under his control."
The woman paused, clearly going over the sums in her head before nodding.
"That seems adequate," she said dismissively, "but you'll have to finalize things with our leader, Fritha." "Your leader?"
she repeated, the woman's imperious air putting her instantly in charge in Nalya's mind.
"Indeed. If she is here, she is in her room. Upstairs, second door on the left."
The woman finished curtly before turning back to her drink, a not so subtle indicator that the conversation, in her view at least, was over. Nalya stood, a little taken aback by her abruptness, before crossing to the stairs, her mind racing as she ascended. They were both clearly awed by any evaluation of the fact. Was she putting her home in even more danger by hiring them? But that was assuming she had a choice. The coin she offered was not exactly a vast sum, and they were the first group who had not outright dismissed her all day. Could she risk refusing this offer, knowing another may not be found for days yet? "See their leader before you make the decision," her mind counseled, and she nodded to herself, hearing the wisdom of it. But what sort of woman could lead those two? An image of her formed behind her eyes. Tall with a strong build, her face, though worn and scarred by countless battles, would still hold a proud beauty. Nalya had reached the door by now and paused a moment, slightly nervous about meeting the imposing figure she had just invented, before she steeled herself and knocked boldly. Fritha sighed and watched the pale amber down on her arms tremble with the breath. After leaving the others, she had done little more than buy a long rusty chainmail shirt before she had grown tired of shopping and returned to the inn. Settling on her bed to sew as soon as she had got back, she had decided to take up the hems on her trousers in another vain attempt to fend off the heat. But the weather and her general despondence with the day meant she had given up before she had even finished one leg, stretching out on the quilt to pillow her head on her arms in attempt to sleep the afternoon away, resolved to look for work once the sun had set. A knock at the door brought her from her dozing though, and she lifted her head slowly to croak, "Come in." She had expected Jahara or perhaps Ari, and Fritha straightened with surprise as the door opened a fraction, just enough for a young woman with shoulder-length red hair and to peer inside. She saw Fritha and appeared to jump, letting go of the door as she did so and allowing it to swing open, revealing herself entirely. Realizing this, the girl straightened and both she and Fritha took a moment to self-consciously tidy their appearances, the girl smoothing out well-cut traveling robes as Fritha sat up to straighten her tunic and attempt to tidy her hair.
"Ah, forgive my intrusion, I was looking for someone named Fritha." "And you have found her, please will you have seat?"
She smiled, gesturing to the chair which was thankfully clear, surrounded by the chaos of supplies that covered the rest of her room.
"I must apologize for the mess, I am unused to the heat here, it makes me tired. Did Jahara send you?"
Nalya nodded, the girl's familiarity unnerving her. This had to be some sort of mistake, this Fritha was barely older than she was. The girl said nothing more though, merely looked at her expectantly and, hesitantly, Nalya began.
"Yes. I am sorry, but after meeting, well, I had expected someone."
The girl smiled, seeming to understand her.
"Jahara is not herself at the moment though Minsk is, I take it you met Boo." "Sorry, oh, the rodent. It is a pet."
The girl smiled mildly.
"Something like that, yes. But I am sure you are not here to talk of that."
"No," she agreed, glad the conversation had returned to more familiar territory.
"My name is Nalya, Lady Nalya d'Arnis. My family's keep was laid siege to but 2 days ago, though I escaped and came to Athkatla to hire mercenaries to help us. I have searched since it was light, but have not had much luck so far." "Well, we shall help you if we can. Who has attacked your keep?"
Nalya opened her mouth and stopped. She couldn't tell her, could bear to have another refuse her when every moment left her home in danger.
"Well."
The girl stared back, unrelenting.
"I appreciate you are worried, Nalya, but I cannot knowingly lead people into an undertaking without all the details. We may need more mercenaries or specialist kit. I am their leader, I have a responsibility to them. They will go where I ask, but I must prepare them as best as I possibly can. You understand, don't you?"
And she did. It was a lecture she had heard her father give Aunt Delcia many times. About how there would be no nobles without peasants, about how they were linked and both must serve each other, one through obedience and the other through rule. Nalya nodded once and found her voice.
"Trolls and you in titanium, I am unsure of the numbers. Perhaps 30 in all."
She watched as the girl frowned slightly, and for one awful moment, she thought it would the same again, that she would apologize as the others had and tell her it was impossible.
"Right,"
Fritha said at last, though more to herself than her.
"Right, I'll need to go back to the market for incendiaries, but other than that. Do you have a room here?"
She asked suddenly and Nalya felt her heart leap. It was confirmed, they would help her.
"And no,"
she stammered, suddenly unable to keep from smiling,
"no, I only arrived this morning."
Fritha nodded once, her calm air of authority was hardening.
"Come, we can rent you one." "Really?"
she exclaimed before she realized to her shame that Fritha may mean for her to hire one.
"I mean it's rather embarrassing, but I don't actually have any money with."
But the girl cut her off without a glance, rising from the bed to pull on her boots and lead the way back into the hall.
"It's quite all right. We can support you until the work is done."
Nalya smiled warmly.
I think my father will approve of you, Fritha."
She did not turn, but Nalia could hear her smile as she continued on down the stairs.
Well, someone has to.
Fritha led the way to the bar, hiring a room for the girl before heading over to Jahara and Minsk, the pair glancing up as they approached.
Young Fritha,
greeted Minsk brightly,
you have decided. We have agreed to help,
she answered, and the ranger's face split with a smile.
Ah, who knew it would be so? Do you often help people?
Came Nalia's voice at her shoulder. Fritha shrugged indifferently.
When the need arises. A Nomen and Ari.
She continued, turning to Jahara.
The Order and the Circus respectively.
Fritha nodded, glancing back to the girl at her side.
Right. Well, you will no doubt meet them later. In the meantime, Nalia, why don't you have a seat and explain your situation more fully to my friends?
Jahara glared up at her as Nalia sank obediently into the chair next to Minsk.
And where are you going?
The druid demanded, though Fritha pretended not to notice her tone.
Back to the promenade,
she answered briskly, no intention of letting anyone else come with her after the palaver of last time.
I will see you all at dinner.
And before another word could be spoken, she had turned on her heel and marched off. Ari strolled the sunlit streets, wending her way through the slums and its jostle of merchants and laborers as they too made their ways back home with the sunset. Not that Ari had any real fear of walking the streets after sundown. She had spent all afternoon at the circus, enjoying the familiarity of a place where she already belonged, just sat laughing and talking with Quail and the others, at ease for the first time since she had left. But it was as the matinee show had been about to start, and everyone had been rushing about finding costumes and props, that had she realized her reluctance to leave and, despite their invitations for her to stay for dinner, she had made herself go, knowing if she did not then, she may have never again. Ari sighed as she pushed open the door of the coronet, her new home, at least for the moment, crossing to take her usual table by the window and signal the waitress. To be honest, she should have no reason not to want to return to her group, they were all good, decent people. But they lacked the easy warmth of her old friends and Ari felt awkward in their company, close enough to them to know of their loss, but too removed to mourn it with them. She understood they had all seen and suffered much in the past 10 days and were still suffering, but only the Rashami showed any sign of recovery. Fritha seemed to try to be friendly, but it was as though she was always struggling to keep everything else afloat as well, the slow ebb and flow of daily life just wearing her away. And the druid was just getting worse, her isolated silences only broken by the occasional sharp remarks aimed at anyone within reach, though even she was preferable to their most recent ally. And as though her thoughts had provoked a malicious fate, at that very instant, the door banged open and Ari was staring across the common room at the broad tall figure of the squire. She instantly dipped her head, but not before he had noticed her, clearly glancing to the bar to see if any of the others were about before marching over to her table.
Ah, Ari, may I join you, my lady?
Ari nodded but said nothing. They were still strangers enough for propriety to rule her actions and she could not really refuse him. She lowered her eyes as a Nomen helped himself to the seat opposite, giving his order to the waitress, and they both sat in silence, the girl returning moments later to set dishes of soup and bread before them. Ari dropped her attention immediately to her bowl, glad of the distraction as the silence over the table took on an awkward air. She may have only known a Nomen a day in total, but she had not taken long to get an impression of the young man and, Ari concluded, the only thing worse than having to eat with him, would be having to talk to him. Ari was the first to admit she found it difficult to put herself forward with strangers, her voice coming quiet and hesitant. But all morning she had been forced to endure his contradictions, the man constantly cutting her off or talking over her as though her contribution was worthless. She could see what he was doing, the boy so full of self-doubt he sought any opportunity to promote himself, even relatively, as though pointing out her own faults would make him seem all the better by comparison to their new companions. But as much as she understood him, it still tended to make her nervous, which in turn, only made it more difficult for her speak her own mind, sentences that sat fully formed in her throat having to be forced, in starts and stutters from hesitant lips. Quail and the others in the circus knew of her difficulties and always gave her a chance to speak. And it seemed Fritha and her friends were of the same mind, though Ari realized that it may have not been entirely intentional on their part, none of them particularly talkative at the moment. Ari glanced across the table to Anomen. She could have almost been sorry for him if she had not felt so wronged, and she sent him a scowl just to be sure to remind herself. However, his gaze was still on his dish and she took a moment to watch him unobserved, taking in the lightly tanned skin, dark brown hair and neat beard, his usual Amnian coloring challenged only by his eyes, which were a startling shade of light blue. Ari crinkled her nose. He was handsome, she concluded, but in a very human sort of way, all broad and loud and certainly not her ideal by any means. He glanced up, catching her eye to give her a questioning look, and Ari let her face fall into an expression of innocent neutrality, though it did not quite fend off his curiosity.
"You have a question for me?"
"And no," she stuttered, dipping her face as she felt the blush surge. She had never been any good at lying.
I was merely wondering where our new friends will lead us in the world."
The man beamed, though it looked very smug from where she was sitting.
"Oh, of course, you do not yet know who they are, do you? Worry not, elf, for we are surely on the path to greatness. Our companions are no less than those who saved Baldur's Gate but a month ago." "Oh, are really? Well, I don't mind what they've previously done."
"They saved your circus," he cut in indignantly, as though he had had a hand in it.
"Yes, and why?"
Ari snapped, her voice coming shrill and unbroken in her irritation at another interruption.
"Not for gold or glory, but because a scared little boy approached them outside and asked them to find his mother."
Anomen snorted, though propriety stifled any other comment as the girl went back to her food. Fritha merely learned of the circus through the boy, sensing the evil at work there and knowing it could not be allowed to continue unchecked. He could hardly believe the elf's naivety, though it suited her, complementing the long golden tresses and innocent blue eyes all too well. There was no denying the girl was fair, but her attitude gave her away as one far too young for the horrors they would no doubt soon be facing. By her reticent nature, Anomen could tell her life in the circus had been sheltered, and he questioned the wisdom of allowing her to join with them. In situations of danger, she would most likely be a liability rather than a help.
"I beg your pardon,"
came a voice at his shoulder, starting him from his thoughts, and he looked up as the elf did to see an attractive young woman stood before them, straight auburn hair just brushing her shoulders, her face pale and lightly freckled.
"But are you Ari and Anomen?" "That we are, my lady." "Oh, I thought the descriptions Jahara gave me matched, may I?"
she continued amiably, gesturing to the seat between them, making no further mention of what the druid had said, and Anomen knew enough to surmise it may not have been complimentary.
"I am Nalia d'Arnis. Fritha has agreed you are to help rout the attack on my keep."
"Nalia," he repeated, sure the name was familiar to him, smiling as he suddenly recalled it.
"Why, I have heard of you. Are you not the young noblewoman who spends all her time slumming?"
Her hazel eyes flashed and he could see Ari smirking into her bowl.
"I do not slum,"
the girl corrected archly, and looking as though it was taking a formidable restraint to stop at that.
"I help people. Has Fritha returned from the market yet?"
she continued, her voice milder as she turned pointedly from him to the elf.
I would know our plans for the morrow. I don't know,
Ari answered quietly.
I have only just returned myself.
A silence seemed to descend upon the table, the idea that it was aimed at him making an omen even more uncomfortable than usual, and at last he drew a breath and volunteered to go and check. He left the table, heading for the stairs with the distinct impression his ears should be burning, though he resisted the temptation to glance back to the pair. Why Fritha had allowed two such girls to join with them, he could not understand. Even Ari would be of more use than a young noblewoman with no martial training. Perhaps Fritha merely judged all by her own standards, for she seemed more than capable and was of a comparable age. Still, he feared it was a mistake, maybe he should mention it to her. But he questioned the thought as soon as it surfaced. Fritha did not seem to be particularly approachable at the moment, he considered, recalling the tired look she had given him when he had shown her the cuirass that morning. Not that he had meant for her to buy it, by any means, he had merely wished to start a rapport with the girl. Anomen frowned slightly. Fritha was clearly still recovering from her capture and he tried to sympathize, but that left him in the company of two petulant young girls, a woman who hardly deigned to speak with him and a man who insisted on spending half any conversation in conference with a hamster. He had reached her door by now, knocking lightly on the wood and finding himself hoping she was in, if only so he did not have to return to the women alone.
My lady. Yes,
came the muffled reply and he pushed the door open, peering into the empty room.
My lady. I'm out here,
she called, and it was only then he noticed the open window. He crossed the room in a couple of strides, leaning out to find her sat upon the roof next to it, feet wedged in the rusted guttering as she gazed out over the cityscape.
What are you doing?
He questioned with frown, and she did not turn to him as she answered.
Just looking for something I've lost.
He followed her eyes back to the horizon, across the jumble of rooftops to where the sea could be seen shimmering under the dying sun.
Have you found it?
He asked, quite at a loss for anything else to say, but she merely exhaled deeply and shrugged.
Not really. Here.
She continued, finally turning to him with a hand outstretched expectantly, and he helped her inside.
You wanted to see me? Yes, the Lady Nalia has approached Ari and I downstairs, explaining our alliance, and she would know our plans for the morrow.
Fritha made no immediate reply though, and he took the time to add tentatively,
she is most anxious.
Fritha sighed again. Come and tell them the plans. Oh, how formal everything had suddenly become. She should not have been surprised. Jahara was the only real voice left among them now, and she had withdrawn completely since. Fritha closed her eyes, a mistake really, as all she saw in the darkness was that mangled corpse, Jahara's sobs echoing about her.
My lady.
Anomen was still there and now staring at her with clear concerns about her mental stability. She smiled as warmly as she could.
Yes. Yes, of course. I shall come now.
End of chapter.